Top 5 Greatest Players of the 1960s. By the time the 1960s rolled around, there was a sports league gaining serious traction. The league and players were already knee-deep into the shot clock, which was implemented in 1954. Players had already implemented it into their game and used it to completely change the dynamic of the game. The early days of the saw big men dominate, and to an extent, that still is the case. But the 1960s saw the game's first shift in style, as guards began to emerge and make a big impact on the game. Some of the best players of the decade, such as Jerry West, were prime examples. Championships are, in the end, the ultimate resume booster for a player and a sign of their greatness. The 1960s saw the Boston Celtics completely dominate the decade, winning all but one title in that period, and therefore snubbing some of the decade's greatest players who did not play for the titles. Therefore, many of the 1960s greatest players did not win titles, but they did win numerous other awards and lead the league in important categories, which ultimately cemented their legacy as some of the game's greats. The following are the 5 greatest players of the 1960s decade. Elgin Baylor. Baylor was one of the greatest all-around players of the 1960s. Perhaps there was no all-around player better than during his peak, which was in the 1960s. Every year of the decade saw him being a player, and he was in every year of the decade apart from 1966, which was a rare down year for. Apart from 1966 and the final 2 years of his career, routinely averaged double digits in rebounds per season. He was constantly finishing within the top 10 in rebounds and is 9th all-time in that category. He also put up insane offense, averaging over 30 points per game in multiple seasons. Baylor was a member of the for his entire career, and as such, he never won a title as the Celtics repeatedly defeated the INA. That did not prevent from putting up insane stats and once again serving as an elite all-around player, one of the best of the 1960s. Oscar Robertson. Robertson lit up the court with otherworldly offense in the 1960s. Oscar Robertson was another player who experienced little playoff success, mostly due to the fact that he spent his entire 1960s career with the later known as the Sacramento Kings. He would go on to win a title with the in 1971, but that would come after the 1960s. Despite the lack of playoff success in the 1960s, was easily one of the most solid and skilled players of the decade. He averaged over 30 points per game in all but 2 seasons of the 1960s and led in assists per game 7 times in that decade. In 1962, averaged a triple-double consisting of 30.8 points, 12.5 rebounds, and 11.4 assists per game that season. While his rebounding would cool off afterward, was still a solid player who sported of the in 1964 and All-Star appearances in every single season of the decade. Jerry West. West was so iconic that he became the league's future logo. While was one of the best guards of the 1960s, it can be argued that West edged him. He was one of the greatest defensive players of the entire decade, and his time with the Lakers made him a star. The fact that he was on the Lakers for his entire career meant that he would not experience the glory of winning until after the 1960s, but his play was without a doubt the best in that decade. He was one of the league's most efficient scorers and to this day ranks 8th all-time in points per game. West played 14 seasons in the and had 14 career appearances. One need not be a mathematician to realize that was so great. He was in every single season of his career, a truly remarkable and legendary feat. West's elite and unique style of play led him to become the actual logo for that gave him the simple yet classic nickname of Automatically, making him one of the most timeless legends in the game's history and, of course, the 1960s. Bill Russell. Russell was one of the most iconic players of all time. Bill Russell was one of the greatest and most influential players and was perhaps the greatest defensive player of all time. And in the 1960s, that is exactly the role he played, providing with stellar defense throughout his 13-year career. the vast majority of which came in the 1960s. Russell led the league in rebounds 5 times in his career, including twice in the 1960s, 1964, and 1965. During the 1960s, he was top 3 in rebounds in every single season. The 5-time also possessed an elite passing ability and finished in the top 10 in assists 4 times in the decade. Championships speak for themselves. Russell was in all but his rookie year, and his numerous accolades combined with his stellar skills and playoff success make him one of the greatest players of not only the 1960s but all time. Wilt Chamberlain. Chamberlain was the greatest player of the 1960s and one of the best scorers in histo.